So this paper is joint with Hesam Bavafa, who couldn't be here, but with Tyler Welch. If you want to wave quickly, he's here. And importantly, on the job market this fall, he's a graduate student at the Wisconsin School of Business and has lots of great work. So this paper is something that's been a bit of a foregone conclusion for much of this conference, in the sense that we've assumed, and for good reason, that there's a lot of inequality in healthy life expectancy in the spans of life. And so this paper really digs just a little bit deeper into that statistic that I think Tyler, myself, and Hesam et al. Heard a lot at conferences but couldn't quite quantify. So the goal of this paper is to better quantify the returns to wealth in healthy and disability-free life expectancy. So the well-known result that income correlates with longer lives. So in particular, I was really influenced by Rod Chetty's work in JAMA that, with many co-authors, that showed that the poorest 1% versus the richest 1% in the US, there's a 15-year life expectancy gap between the individuals at each of those ends of the distribution. And so the question that we all had going into this paper was, with those 15 years, what does it look like in terms of the breakdown between healthy and not healthy life years? Later, we also became interested in working and not working life years in that 15-year, for example, gap. And how does that vary by wealth? Is it something that's continuous across the wealth spectrum, or really quite stark in certain areas of the spectrum? And so this really connects to a lot of the work that's been discussed today. And so what do? I think we analyze cohorts turning age 65 1 decade apart in recent US history. And the goal is to basically look at how these two cohorts have aged over a decade following turning 65, and not only looking within cohort, but also across the cohorts to better understand the returns to being wealthy in these important outcomes. And so what do we find? We find that the wealthiest do indeed live longer and work longer. And I think the main contribution maybe from today's talk, starting with Amal's talk on inequalities in old age, to like Steve and Olivia's paper on extending the health span, all these types of things. I think the one contribution of this paper maybe to today's discussion is that the gradients are much more unequal than maybe we discuss. And so I'll try to focus on that a bit today. So just the three questions. First, we have a static component. What is the return to wealth in healthy life expectancy and ability to work just within a cohort, like for example in 1996 or in 2006? And the second part is dynamic. So knowing that there'll be a gradient, how are these gradients changing across time? Like, is the world becoming more unequal or less equal? And finally, this is a more recent addition to the paper, but we've been interested in how, because the data set we use also asks about subjective patterns in these outcomes, we're interested in how much people's perceptions of life expectancy and health and work align with what we empirically observe. And so the data we use is the Health and Retirement Study. We supplement with Social Security and other data on life tables, but the basic core of the study is from the Health and Retirement Study, which surveys on health, wealth, and work every 2 years. In this version of the presentation, I think will be quite simple in what we think about as disability and work. Disability is having any assisted daily living, so any activity of daily living help, where like could be needing help, bathing, eating, anything. Work is going to be defined as doing any paid work, and we're looking at people age 65 and more, right? So we could go into earnings and what type of work. We haven't done that for this version of the paper. And so the method is basically to calculate life expectancy and then multiply each year of being alive with your probability of being disabled or your probability of working, and then adding those up over the life expectancy. And so, like I said, we supplement with some data as needed. And so just sort of one slide on a little bit of the weeds of what we do. As I mentioned, we're comparing these two cohorts turning age 65 in, it's 1992 and 2012. We do two versions of this. It's also 96 and 2006. We have two different versions floating about. And we calculate life expectancy following Rod Chetty and co-authors' work. We calculate disability following Mike Chernew's and co-authors' work. So we're not really innovating on sort of the methodologies here. The main thing that we're going to do is then predict, are you disabled, for example, in this year? And I've boxed the coefficient that we're most interested in, which is basically an interaction, especially as we look at the dynamic part of the regression. It's an interaction of the cohort, like for example, are you in the 2006 cohort, and your wealth quartile. And so that's going to tell us about whether the return to wealth in these outcomes is changing for more recent cohorts versus earlier ones. And so let me just maybe preview or show you the results here. I'm not tall enough to see my own slides, so tippy-toe a little bit, just so we're looking at the same thing. We have a couple of versions of these graphs. But this is, for example, the main sets of findings, right? So within cohort disabled life years, we find that the wealthiest quartile has the least disabled years, right, post age 65. Thank you, Nick. And so we find this really interesting, right, because it's not, like you might expect a fully linear slope here, right, but that's not the case, right? So Q1 is the poorest quartile of wealth at age 65. And we find that they have about 4.5 years of disabled life years expectancy at that age, which drops to 4 years for the next quartile. But then it's about 3.5 years for the upper kind of upper half of the wealth. Disability-free life years are also increasing in wealth, and this is more continuous, right? So we have the poorest can expect to have about 11 more years of disability-free life at age 65, and that increases, it looks like somewhat steadily, to around 18 years of disability-free life for the richest quartile. When we do the same types of regressions for work, and what we find here, we're kind of unsure what to expect going into this, right? Because it could be that the poorest and the least wealthy need to work longer. It could be that the most wealthy are able to retire earlier. But what we found is that the working life years is less linear, but at least the wealthiest do show the greatest number of working years post age 65. And the least wealthy, again, are showing the smallest number of years working post age 65. I will point out, just as food for discussion, I think it's not here, unfortunately, but it's in the paper. I think when we break this down by gender, I think the female pattern is much more jumpy, right, Tyler? Like, I think it's much, so sort of in line with some of these conversations we've had around caregiving and other things. I think in general, the female work participation is harder to predict, at least using wealth. When we look at, again, work-free life years, right, so we think of this a little bit, we combine this later in the paper where we think about some golden years where you might be both work-free and healthy. But we find that these are, again, concentrated among the wealthiest, right? So the wealthiest quartile is not only working more in the old age, but it's also retaining the most years work-free. And so this is, I think, the story that is the basic idea of the paper, is to try and understand the gradients of working, work-free, healthy, unhealthy, and understanding these sort of the dynamics, the pattern, and then next the dynamics. And so what we do when we try to understand the dynamics is we basically run regressions like this. I'll visualize this for you in a minute, but the basic idea is a regression that looks at, for example, are you disabled in this wave of the survey as a function of your wealth quartile, and then interacted with the next cohort's wealth quartile, right? So the idea will be to try and understand whether the return to being in the wealthiest quartile is different in 2006 or in 1996 versus 2006. So it'll make more sense maybe as I plot it. So then we look at between cohort results. We're basically showing the 1996 return and the 2006 return and how it's changed. And to us, what stood out is that, for example, when we look at disabled life years, the least wealthy quartile, which is the poorest quartile, not only has the least healthy life years to begin with, but is also experiencing the largest increase in them over this decade. And the increase isn't very much for the wealthiest quartile, right? This is the full top quartile of US wealth at age 65. We're not seeing a huge amount of change for the top quartile, but a substantial change at the bottom. So when we think about sort of these needs as they evolve, it seems to be very unequal across the wealth distribution. Same with work. I mean, with work, we see across quartiles more increases in work overall. But again, the wealthiest quartile is experiencing the greatest increase in the work years over the two cohorts. And interestingly, the quartile one, maybe that's the one that's more interesting to highlight, but they're really not experiencing a substantial change in the number of years working post age 65 across the two cohorts. So we think about this caveat, which I know Sita might dig deeper into in her paper, that I think is in the elephant in the room, like health affects wealth, which in turn affects health. So in the paper, what we do, we understand that there's a simultaneity of wealth and health, and so I think our favorite robustness check, Tyler and I have different favorites maybe. we like all of them to some degree, but I think our favorite one is the first one, where we replicate all of our findings, but instead of doing quartiles of wealth, we do quartiles of education, which we find to be, that's something that's fixed much earlier in life, maybe by age. For us, it's like age 50, maybe, but for many, it's generally by age 25 or so, you've sort of fixed your education. It's hard to spend down education. So we find the same results, really, when we look at it by education instead of wealth. We also try to understand the effect of health on wealth in other ways by looking at pre-65 hospitalizations and other things. So finally, we look at the subjective expectations. And here we see some flatness bias, which is, I think, what the literature has called this, which is that people, when you ask them, like the HRS asks, do you think you will live to be age 80 to 100, we don't see the increase across cohorts that matches the empirical findings, right? So people are not necessarily thinking that they're going to live for much longer by their wealth or by their cohort than compared to what we see empirically. The subjective work expectations seem a little bit better aligned, like people do seem to believe that they will be working. The question is, do you anticipate working full-time after age 65? And that seems to match the empirical patterns a little bit better. But in general, we find, we looked at some other subjective expectations around health and wealth. I think overall there's some misalignment on the health measures, like life expectancy and health, but a little bit more on work. And so just in conclusion, these wealth gaps exist and are growing. I think that's the important part of our paper, not just that they exist and quantifying the pattern, but that they're growing. They don't appear to be driven by the health-wealth relationship prior to age 65. The subjective expectations are a little bit flat, and we hope that this contributes and starts some conversation around what implications these have for retirement saving, quality of life, and particularly with the subjective and objective misalignment, to what degree people's financial decision making in terms of how they're saving, how they're planning to work, how that might align with, or how can we better align them with what appears to be objectively true. So I'll stop there, and thank you for your time and attention.